Oh boy. So, hi everybody. Today's lecture is about modernism, and specifically modernism in literature. Modernism is such a difficult and elusive concept to nail down and define in a way that is satisfying. That is primarily because modernism encompasses so many different things. In some way, most movements that came after World War I and World War II embrace modern values some way, somehow. But that method of embracing modernist values can take any number of different forms and has taken any number of different forms. One of the battle cries for modernism comes from Ezra Pound, who said, just make it new. So this idea that anything that is new and anything that goes against the grain of what has been considered commonplace up to that point could, in many ways, be considered modernist. You can kind of begin to apprehend the concept by trying to visualize it as the sum total of the meta movement that we have been discussing throughout the entire semester. Where we started with the Romantics was with a skepticism of urbanization, with a skepticism toward collectivism and more focus on society and on the masses generally, and a rejection of those concerns for the sake of a greater focus on the individual and the power of an individual to determine for themselves what is meaningful and what is good and right and proper through an act of exploring their own self, exploring their own values and their sense of things, which William Wordsworth would have said speaks to a certain connection that each human has with the divineness of the world around them. Furthermore, the Romantics rejected any sense of the answers to these questions coming from without, specifically coming from institutions that have propped up society, specifically academic institutions and higher learning. Of course, we see some pushback against that during the Victorian period, and we see this in the split that art takes during the Victorian period between the highbrow and the lowbrow, where the lowbrow was basically there to just sort of entertain and titillate the masses, whereas highbrow art continue to stand apart from that and embrace anything that simply tries to make the world a little bit more beautiful. Probably the key watershed moment for any discussion of modernism is good old World War I. World War I being a display of the sheer brutality of life and of the world we live in. The key outcome of World War I for modernism is the sheerly pessimistic view that many artists had towards any sense that there is any meaning in the world, any meaning inherent in the world at least. When it comes to modernism in literature, the key artifact of modernist writing is experimentation. And this experimentation can be a matter of either form or content of literature. In terms of the content of modernist writing, one aspect is the complete and utter rejection of anything that could be considered objective truth. Gone is the idea that there is anything resembling a capital T truth with regard to meaning in life and the purpose of human toil and existence. Now, instead of there being one capital T truth, you have just numerous lowercase t truths. These truths are often in competition and maybe even direct conflict with each other. And this is something that gets explored in modernist focus on subjectivity and the individual. Most of the great modernist thinkers explored this idea of subjectivity and relativism in any number of different fields of study. Possibly the most famous philosophical modernist thinkers are Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche took a very nihilistic approach to his philosophy, declaring that life is utterly meaningless, while also finding a certain excitement to be found in that, because now no longer are you told what your life means from without. You have the opportunity to explore your own meaning in life. And this would be a concept that further thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre would pick up on and extrapolate upon for philosophical thoughts such as existentialism. Existentialism is essentially the idea that an individual must find and define for themselves what their life's worth and what their life's meaning is. Sartre again puts the individual at odds with the rest of society. Because according to Sartre, an individual is under constant pressure from outside forces to change who they are. Society is feeding to the individual certain narratives that place pressure on that individual to adopt their truths as a replacement for finding their own. We have talked previously about Sigmund Freud and how his studies helped influence thoughts about how the mind works and how the mind and individuality play into each other. You can even provide a modernist reading to the works of someone like Albert Einstein. His theory of relativity is essentially the idea that perception of time and place is influenced by individuals. That how one experiences time and space varies depending on an individual's placement relative to it and perception of it. And so finding oneself at a loss for truth being ascribed to one from without, one is left with only the option to explore truth from within. And so the content of modernist art and modernist literature is an exploration of the self. In terms of literary forms, one of the most prominent features of modernist writing is stream of consciousness writing. Stream of consciousness writing is an attempt to replicate in literary form the interior monologue of characters. No longer is literature mostly concerned with telling stories. Now literature is more focused on how an individual person makes meaning through their consciousness and how an individual experiences in that regard a certain alienation between themselves and the rest of society. There is also a decreased focus on narrative flow. In fact, many modernist writings intentionally obscure satisfying narrative in the traditional sense. In the idea that stories have a beginning, middle, and end, modernist writing also relies heavy on symbolism and plays with the effect that language has on one's ability to make meaning for themselves. Our language is entirely arbitrary. How we have decided to communicate ideas to each other is not based in anything real or natural. We simply have identified a thing in the world and have given that thing a name, and that name is entirely arbitrary. I'm looking at a tree right now. Because I speak English, I call it a tree. Speakers of other languages call that something else. And the name that we give something affects how we interact with it. And also think of all the other things in the world that we might call a tree. The signifier and the signified are not necessarily integral to each other. And how one perceives the world and makes meaning of it is limited by the language that they speak. And so modernist literature plays with this interrelationship between the language we speak and the way that language helps, or in many cases interferes with, our ability to understand and relate to the world. Scene change. Getting a little crowded in there now that all the ladies of the house are awake. Speaking of ladies of the house, Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was one of the most important modernist writers of the 20th century and was one of the early experimenters with specifically stream of consciousness writing. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 to an affluent family that spent most of its time living in upper-class areas of London like Hyde Park. Her father was a well-known author and historian. Her mother was actually a pre-Raphaelite model. She was part of a blended family. She had a couple of natural blood sisters and then a few half-siblings from her parents' separate marriages and relationships prior to their gathering. Ultimately, she was child 7 of 8 in this family. She was homeschooled through most of her childhood, despite the fact that her brothers were sent to boarding school. In 1895, when she was 13 years old, Virginia Woolf's mother died. And this was the event in her life that is often given credit for triggering what would end up being a lifelong struggle with mental health. She began experiencing very deep bouts of depression, punctuated by moments of spontaneous manic energy, but she always carried with her a heaviness and a sense of futility in life. Shortly after her mother died, she lost one of her sisters, and then she lost another very close friend by the name of Stella Duckworth. This compounded her struggle with mental illness. She would, over the course of her life, spend a great deal of time in mental hospitals. The treatment of mental illness in women at the time was very callous and in many ways brutal and unforgiving. Total absence of any kind of stressful work, isolation, force feeding, predicated on the idea that 100% of a woman's mental health issues are caused either by overwork overstimulation, or overproductivity. And the sources of these stressors frequently came from a woman's desire to either do work or be educated. She began writing professionally at her father's insistence in 1900. She had a very curious relationship with her father, being that while she acknowledged her father's importance in her pursuit of literary life, she also saw her father as being kind of a tyrant and kind of a brutal authority figure in her life. When he died in 1904, Virginia Woolf attempted suicide by throwing herself out of a window. Although she started writing right at the dawn of the century, she wouldn't publish her first novel until 1915. That novel is entitled The Voyage Out. I'm bathed in a weird halo of light here. I hope that it's not distracting. Over the course of her literary career, she would produce a number of novels, all of which that have since then become sort of staples of modernist literature. Scene change. The 1920s was certainly her most successful decade as a writer, starting in 1925 with Mrs. Dalloway, 1927 with To the Lighthouse, 1928 with Orlando, a biography. Over the course of her literary career, she would write some 500 essays and literary reviews, and became well known and well respected amongst the British literati. But when World War II happened, she found her struggle with depression and mental illness unwinnable. She saw her London home being destroyed in the German Blitz. Most of her diary writing became very clearly obsessed with death and dying. And then on one morning in March in 1941, she filled her pockets full of rocks and walked into a river and drowned herself. But it is because of her struggle with mental illness, and it is because of the research and her desire to understand her conditions that influenced her narrative style very heavily. Our reading for this week, which was The Mark on the Wall, is a quintessential example of stream of consciousness writing. It is not nearly as inaccessible as some later attempts to replicate the interior monologues of characters, but it still bears many of the hallmarks of modernist writing. You may have noticed as you read The Mark on the Wall that there is practically no story. There is no action, and barely anything happens. The closest thing that one could ascribe to actions is at the very end of the story when whoever the narrator is sharing their room with decides to get up and go get a newspaper. That is literally the only action that takes place. Everything else about the story is a representation of the narrator's thought process on beholding a mark on the wall and the narrator's attempt to figure out what that mark is. What's key to your reading of The Mark on the Wall is the free association and the non-linear flow of thoughts that is emblematic of how an individual's consciousness functions. The manner with which the narrator explores the possible explanation for what the mark on the wall is frequently leaves the subject of what that mark on the wall is and dives into just a all-out exploration of the narrator's personality. Scene change. The sun is moving very fast right now, and I'm having a hard time staying visible on camera because of it. So, the things that get explored as the narrator contemplates what the mark on the wall is take us through a journey of this person's... God, I hate working from home. I really miss my office. The things that get discussed and explored as the narrator... See how easily your conscience just goes pew! The things that get touched upon and explored as the narrator tries to determine what the mark on the wall is take us through a journey of the narrator's total psychological makeup. This story paints a deeply intimate portrait of the narrator's personality by showing us what kinds of things spring to the narrator's mind based on the most insignificant and minute stimuli. The narrator touches upon history, literature, philosophy, psychology, modern consumerism, the value of material goods, the fall of Troy, being born again and reaching the afterlife, Shakespeare, boredom, thinking about thoughts, the curiosity that exists in modern life, what might be the state of literature in the far-off future, archaeology, witchcraft, nightmares. All are ideas which are relatively insignificant to the question of what is the mark on the wall. What you're invited to explore as you read a story like this is the quickness with which one's mind darts from topic to topic in a manner that is only meaningful to the person who is having those thoughts. When you lay back on the couch and you have a psychologist rattle off a list of words, and the goal of that being for you to say the first word that pops into your mind, that is a display of how you have learned to associate ideas to yourself in order to make knowledge and make memories. That's how the human brain works. It takes something that is new and unfamiliar and attaches it to something that is already learned and already familiar. This means that every individual learns differently and associates. This means that every individual learns differently. Every individual comes... The world is against me today. Every individual comes to meaning through different avenues of association. What stream of consciousness writing tries to do is to mimic the unraveling of those associations for the sake of exploring how an individual constructs meaning from their own existence and experience. You can compare the amount of content in a story like this and the relationship between the content that is actively seeking to explore and determine what the mark on the wall is, and that content which is simply generated by having had that thought. Probably my favorite portion of this story is the moment where she asks, well, why don't I just get up and look? No, nothing is proved, nothing is known, and if I were to get up at this very moment and ascertain that the mark on the wall is really, what shall we say, the head of a gigantic old nail driven in 200 years ago, which has now, owing to the patient attrition of many generations of housemaids, revealed its head above the coat of paint, and is taking its first view... Speaking of nails, and is taking its first view of modern life in the sight of a white-walled, fire-lit room, what should I gain? Knowledge? Matter for further speculation? I can think sitting still as well as standing up. And what is knowledge? What are learned men save the descendants of witches and hermits who crouched in caves and woods brewing herbs, interrogating shrew mice, and writing down the language of the stars? And the less we honor them as our superstitions dwindle and our respect for beauty and health of mind increases, yes, one could imagine a very pleasant world. A quiet, spacious world with the flowers so red and blue in open fields. A world without professors and specialists or housekeepers with the profiles of policemen. A world which one could slice through one's thought as a fish slices the water with his fin, grazing the stems of the water lilies, hanging suspended over nests of white sea eggs. How peaceful it is down there, rooted in the center of the world and gazing up through the gray waters with their sudden gleams of light and their reflections. If it were not for Whitaker's Almanac, if it were not for the table of precedency. Think about how your own mind works. Think about how your own mind works when it's left to its own devices specifically. Think about how your mind works when you're laying in bed at night trying to fall asleep. When your head first hits the pillow, very likely your thoughts are a matter of concentrated effort. You're going over the day that you just had. You're thinking about the key events that took place and how those key events may influence the day that you're going to have when you wake up. You're going to think about your plans for the next day and what you want to get out of the next day. And you're going to address concerns and worries and desires that you have with regard to what happens the next day. But slowly, as you lose conscious control over the flow of your own thoughts, your mind begins to leap from thought to thought and connection to connection. Next thing you know, you're thinking about a childhood memory that involved someone pushing you on the playground and you getting your knee scraped. You're going to be thinking about something that has absolutely nothing to do with the thoughts that you had that kicked it off, which was, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to make for dinner tomorrow night? And what do I need to get at the store? Everyone has experienced this. Everyone likely experiences this multiple times a day. Anytime you let your mind wander, the potential for these associations and for this wandering and for this getting off track. Have you ever hated the sound of birds? Try playing the sound of birds over the sound of your neighbor hammering on something. And in the end, what does the mark on the wall end up being? It ends up being just a stupid little snail. That's part of what this story is putting on display. The insignificance and the utter meaninglessness of what the question's answer is. What is the mark on the wall? It's a snail. That doesn't matter. That doesn't matter at all. What matters is the spontaneous flow of thought and the spontaneous generation of meaningful associations that can be brought about by such an insignificant external stimuli. The Mark on the Wall is most likely not going to be your favorite story that we have read this semester. I assign Mark on the Wall primarily because you got to read something by Virginia Woolf, because she's just so important and influential and worthy of our time. But also because the Mark on the Wall is one of the early examples of this specific kind of experimentation in literature, this play with the idea of stream of consciousness, of how writing is going to become as subjective as subjectivity gets, and how an individual's thought process is affected by not just what happens to them in the present, in the real world, but how that present interaction and how that external stimuli that you are experiencing now plays with your entire personality and your whole history as a person based in these associations that you have made throughout your life that have determined your worldview and your personality. And the fact that Virginia Woolf was someone who struggled with their own mental health, and the fact that Virginia Woolf was someone for whom meaning was so elusive and for whom existence was so futile, for lack of a better word, meant that she was in a particularly unique place to have the kind of influence on literature that she did, that she was uniquely positioned to provide a new avenue for literary explanation that has become one of the most fundamental tools of all writing since then. Speaking of futile, it seems like there's no quiet place for me to deliver a lecture today, so we will stop here. I love you all. I miss you all. Once again, I wish we were having this conversation in person. Cheers, everyone. See you in the future.